Friedman, former U.S. ambassador to Israel and one of the architects of the Abraham Accords. Thank you very much for coming, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Yaakov. Good to see you.
It's been a year. I saw some celebrations, new administrations, both in Israel and at the U.S., and you guys were a little left out, I thought. Any hard feelings about that?
No, not at all. The Abraham Accords speak for themselves. They're enduring. They're incredible. We're happy to let history be our judge.
Abraham Accords. By the way, who came up with this name?
So it was come up with by Major General Miguel Correa. He was one of our partners in this. He is a special forces guy who knew the people well in the Emirates. And as we were getting ready, maybe an hour before we were about to go live, we realized we needed a name. And he said to us, "How about the Abraham Accords?" And immediately it just resonated. And so we got on the phone and we checked with all our partners, and they all thought it was a great name. And we'll give him the credit for it. It's a very powerful name. You know, at the time, we were focused on the substance, not the name. But looking back on it, we're so lucky that we came up with a name that resonates to so many people.
Not only the name. I know that your whole approach to this is basically biblical, isn't it?
Well, look, the Bible is a great inspiration to me. It's the leading light in my life. But as an American diplomat, I'm dealing in the 21st century with 21st century issues, and sometimes the Bible is not the guiding light that you need. But here, what struck me was that Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. They both became great nations. God promised they would both become great nations, but they were also rivals. Ishmael was banished from Abraham's house. But when Abraham passed away, the Bible tells us that Isaac and Ishmael, Yitzchak and Ishmael, got together and they buried their father together in the cave of Machpelah, in the tomb of the patriarchs. And that reconciliation was viewed by biblical authorities as very significant. So we know that Arabs and Jews can live together. We know they can resolve their differences and reconcile because they did so 4,000 years ago. And the idea of bringing that forward 4,000 years and to bring it into modern times, to me, was very powerful.
I'd like to show a clip now. Actually, the beginning of a new documentary that will premiere in Jerusalem next week.
Yes.
About the Abraham Accords and yourself. Let's take a look.
In the ancient history of the Middle East, a man named Abraham received a promise from God that he would become the father of many nations. The Bnei Yisrael are the Jewish descendants of Abraham's son Isaac from his wife Sarah. The Bnei Ishmael are the Arabic descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael from his wife's handmaiden Hagar. From the house of Israel, the Jewish prophet Moses would be born, and the Torah would be written. Centuries later, from the house of Israel, Jesus, the Messiah of the Christian faith, would be born, and the New Testament would be written. From the house of Ishmael, the Islamic prophet Muhammad would be born, and the Quran would be written. Through the centuries, the three religions of the Abrahamic faith have collided. In no place more so than Jerusalem. With the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, ancient nations were restored in the Middle East, including the state of Israel, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. And every U.S. president since has tried with greater or lesser success to build the alliances needed for a lasting peace. Recently, at an unlikely time, with an unlikely group, led by an unlikely president, nations of the divided faiths of Abraham came together against all odds and laid a foundation for peace that bears the name of their common father, the Abraham Accords.
Abraham Accords. Now, you said an unlikely group of people and an unlikely president, which I thought was both funny and interesting. Why did you say that?
The president had never held a political job before. Neither had I, neither had Jared, neither had Secretary Mnuchin. Obviously, Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo hadn't served in Congress, but this was many of us were starting from scratch.
And you were very lucky, we must say. I'm thinking about your tenure, 4 years here in Israel, a peace accord, no major wars, pretty lucky.
Look, there's no question that we were lucky. I would say I would put it a little differently. I'd say we had God's help during our efforts, but look, I think we also knew what we were doing. There's a reason why there were no wars. The reason why there were no wars was because there was no advantage to anyone starting a war with Israel, because they knew that the United States had Israel's back completely. There wouldn't be any second guessing. There wouldn't be any arguments about proportional force or, hold back here, hold back there. And I think that message was delivered on numerous occasions, and that's the reason. It's not just luck.
Right. Now, there are other descendants of Ishmael as well. They're called Palestinians. Mm-hmm. When is this issue going to be addressed?
Look, if you look at the film, you'll see that we addressed it significantly. We held a conference in Bahrain that was singularly designed to help create a better economy for the Palestinians, to help build infrastructure that they need. We put out a peace plan that would have significantly expanded the geographic footprint of the Palestinians. We tried. We'll keep trying. I mean, I'm not in office anymore, but we'll keep trying.
But they were not impressed.
Well, look, I think to a certain extent they saw themselves as having a veto on progress. And it was a very dangerous position to take, because as long as they viewed that they would have a veto on progress, it would be impossible to make any kind of a deal. Now they learned that they can't hold back progress. They couldn't hold back the move of the embassy. They couldn't hold back the Golan Heights. They couldn't hold back the Abraham Accords with nations in the Gulf. It's not because any of those parties is not interested in helping them solve their problems, but they do need a dose of realism, and their leadership does need to change.
Many people thought that these accords are very fragile. Like, what happens if the Palestinian issue starts to flare up here?
Well, we know the answer, because we had a war this past summer,
right,
in Gaza, 11 days. And during those 11 days, the people of the Gulf were getting their news from news sources that were not friendly to Israel. It was being reported, I think, in a way that was antagonistic to Israel. And I went to the Gulf after the war was over. I met with the foreign ministers of each of the countries involved, and I said, how do we do? We just had a war. We had a stress test. How did we do? And they all said the same thing. We passed with flying colors. This did not jeopardize any of our relationships. I think their view is simple. They understand that Israel has a different view of the Palestinian conflict than they might, a different approach to resolving it. But their view is, okay, we can continue to discuss that, maybe even disagree, but we still have a relationship. Look, there are members of Congress in the United States that don't have a favorable view of Israel. Israel doesn't share the same view as the United Kingdom, Canada. still has relationships with these countries. And that's a huge move forward to get the Palestinian issue into perspective. It's a conflict, it should be resolved, but it doesn't freeze the rest of the world from going forward.
Israeli foreign minister just said the other day that he's expecting more from the Gulf states. So who's next? Oman, maybe?
If I were still in the government, I'd have a better sense. They're not sharing this with me right now. But those opportunities, we know from our own experience a year ago that there are other countries that are waiting to join. And I wish the Israeli government, I wish the U.S. government, I wish them luck. I think this should be expanded. I hope they succeed.
How close were the Saudis to join in?
I think that it would have happened. I'm not really able to calibrate. By the way, I couldn't have calibrated any of the other countries either, because it wasn't like you go 30%, 60%, 80% deal. You know, it was binary. No deal, deal. You know, so with the Saudis, it'll be the same thing. But I'm very confident that had we still been in office, the Saudis would be normalizing.
What was, like, you know, the single biggest motive, would you say, of the Gulf states to join this accord?
Look, I think that this has been cultivated for many, many, many years. In other words, long before we got there, the Israelis were under the cover having relations with a lot of these countries. The question was there a political opportunity to surface that relationship and make it public? Because when it's public, you can do obviously much more: tourism, commerce, everything else. And I think that what it came down to, and this is a point we make in the film, it came down to trust. We developed a level of trust with our allies, with Israel, with UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Sudan. They felt that we were all together on the same page, with the same values and the same objectives. Each country is different, but with the same basic objectives. And I think that trust brought it over the mountain. And these were personal relationships. These were relationships that were cultivated over 4 years, and they bore fruit.
But now we have two different administrations, both in Israel and in the United States. Does that change anything?
Well, it could. I think the biggest issue for regional peace in the Middle East is the role that the United States plays going forward as a projector of its strength and its values to the region. So if you ask me, are you more afraid of Iran or Afghanistan? I would say Afghanistan, because the message that America sent to the world in Afghanistan was extraordinarily dangerous as it relates to Israel, as it relates to its allies. Iran is a serious problem too, but you know, we're not. I hope we're not going to chase Iran into a bad deal. I don't know. The jury's out. But Afghanistan, I've never seen America look so weak and unfortunately inept. And when America projects that level to the world, all the players here, I think, are at risk.
Mr. Ambassador, when we come back, you'll take us behind the scenes of the Abraham Accords. You'll give us the juice. A short break, and we'll be right back with Ambassador David Friedman here on Middle East Now.